Hello, and welcome back to our study of Daniel. We are in chapter 11 today. You just watched a short video of a man who'd been struggling with homelessness, and this group discovered him and found out about his situation and offered him the chance to come in and get a haircut, get some new clothes and things like that. And you could see what a powerful difference it made for him. Just overwhelmed by the end of the video. And then you could see in the postscript there some of the changes that it made in his life then. Just feeling like he was in a better position physically allowed some big changes to happen for him, which is great. I really love time-lapse videos like that. I mean, I know that was a couple hours of work they were doing there, but for us it was about 2 minutes to watch it. So you have this fast-forwarded transformation process that ends in this really good place. In our section today, we have some hyper-specific prophecy, I would say. I know we've had some chapters like that in Daniel, and I've had the privilege of teaching those where it's pretty clear that you can see, okay, this is this country and this ruler and this. It kind of even kicks up a notch beyond that in chapter 11. These very specific things about how the battles are going to go and how the treachery takes place. And so you get to see hundreds of years of world history and these really huge, impactful things happening. But we read it in the span of a few sentences. And it's from, when Daniel's receiving this vision and this talk with this angel messenger, it hasn't happened yet. So it's not like this is a history lesson looking back. It's God giving Daniel and the Jews and us some very specific things to kind of, paint our hope on that, okay, this God that we have knows exactly how this is all going to play out. Not generically, oh, kingdoms will rise and fall, but no, specifically. This king will try to use his daughter to manipulate the political situation here, and this is how it's going to go. So I know we've had a couple chapters like that in Daniel, but this one is just, in some ways, even greater. So this time-lapse concept of watching all this stuff take place, and it ends, as we would expect, in a perfect spot, that God's people are victorious because of him. You see the picture next to me here, the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Some of the things that Daniel is told here about Israelite history are pretty rough. But he also is made well aware that God will be with them the whole time, and God will give them the backbone to stand up at different points. The objectives you have on your sheet: first, revel in the specific details of prophecy in Daniel chapter 11. Again, it's pretty amazing. And then to appreciate what effect this behind-the-scenes look has on God's people in a broken world. We've said it a lot of times during this study that our world can feel crazy and chaotic and broken. And to go through Daniel right now was just, I think, a great decision, because it shows us that no matter how crazy things seem, God is still in control, and he has this all very well mapped out, and it ends with victory. Okay, so on the top of your sheet there, you have overview of Daniel chapter 10. The reason that's on there, that the Sunday group didn't make it through chapter 10 last week, but you did on the Zoom study. So we're not going to really cover that in this video or during our Zoom lessons. Just a quick reminder of what that was all about. It was this angel messenger coming to Daniel, and we talked about in the Zoom groups and in the video exactly who was that guy. It certainly seems, at the very least, an angel messenger. But looking at Ezekiel, looking at Revelation, seems to suggest that Daniel was talking with the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. And I got a picture of Transfiguration here, just because that was a day when Jesus revealed his true glory as God and shone like the sun. And you just picture someone looking like this, shining like the sun. There's some very descriptive phrases in Daniel chapter 10, but just envision this divine messenger is standing in front of Daniel, and Daniel is overwhelmed to the point that he's fainting and he can't stand up. And several times this divine messenger has to help Daniel to his feet and encourage him, so then he can hear and receive the vision and words that we have in Daniel chapter 11. Okay, let's read our first section here. The kings of the south and the north. Now then, I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out towards the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. So some of this is very familiar. It sounds a lot like the vision that Nebuchadnezzar received in chapter 2, and also what we talked about in chapter 8, the visions there of the 4 animals. So you've got right off the bat 4 kings of Persia and a mighty king of Greece. That 4th king was very likely Xerxes. It was a very powerful ruler of Persia. And just we should go back and say the setting of this vision now is the Persian Empire is in charge of Babylon, what had been Babylon now here. So I know we've been kind of jumping through time with these visions in Daniel the Lion's Den. So think of the Persian Empire being in control. Cyrus is in charge. So Daniel's receiving this message that Persian Empire will be in control for a couple more 100 years. But this 4th king Xerxes, things are going to be different. As a side note, Xerxes is the king in the book of Esther. If you ever read the book of Esther, it deals with the Jewish relationship with the Persian Empire, and Xerxes is the king there. Xerxes really staked everything on an invasion of Greece. You can tell that Greece was becoming this up-and-coming power, and so he tried to invade them, get them before they could get him, and it didn't go well, and Alexander the Great arose. And then in verse 4, that's a familiar concept again. Alexander the Great died. His descendants, he had 2 young sons that should have been heirs to the throne, but they were killed in the chaos surrounding Alexander's death. And instead, his empire, after 20 years, went to these 4 different generals who, that becomes a huge thing in this section, that you've got what used to be this powerful empire is now parceled out into 4 pieces. All right, let's read the next section. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he, and will rule his own kingdom with great power. After some years they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days she will be betrayed, together with her royal escort, and her father, and the one who supported her. One from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years he will leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army, which will sweep on like an irresistible flood, and carry the battle as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. When the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride, and will slaughter many thousands, yet he will not remain triumphant. For the king of the north will muster another army larger than the first, and after several years he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. I will be honest, there are some confusing back and forth sections here. We skipped the first activity there because we'll talk about it when we meet in Zoom, but I wanted to get to this point so we could look at the map and show you something. So you have the south and the north referenced a few times. That arrow on the far left is pointing to Egypt. So whenever you see the south here, think of Egypt. That arrow to the top pointing at Syria, that's the kingdom of the north. So you have these 2 kingdoms that are going to be battling back and forth a lot in our chapter here. And these are really ruled by descendants of those 4 pieces of the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great's empire that was broken up. These are 2 pieces of that empire. And so at some points you have the rulers of these 2 lands in alliance with each other, but more often than not, they're fighting each other, trying to gain control of their territory. Now, that middle arrow, I should say, is pointing to Israel. Guess who's caught in the middle of all of this? Israel. So, unfortunately, as these 2 kingdoms of the north and south are battling each other, who receives a lot of the brunt of their destruction? It's Israel. A lot of the battleground tends to be Israel. So, the blood is being shed on their land and among their people, because 2 countries around them are at war. Here's a chart, and I know you're not going to be able to retain all of this right away, but here's a chart of all the different people involved. What makes it confusing is, sort of like the British monarchy or the French monarchy. You have these rulers who have the same name, but they're just adding a Roman numeral at the end. So you've got a lot of people named Antiochus there, a couple people named Seleucus, a couple Ptolemies, but this just gives you a chance, and you can pause here if you want to get a better look at this. So Syria up in the north is Antiochus and Seleucus, and at the bottom of that left-hand column, you'll see Antiochus Epiphanes, who will play a huge role in our chapter. We met him back in chapter 8, doing horrible things to God's people. The middle column there is Egypt in the south, and those are the Ptolemies. Sometimes they have other names, as you see in the parentheses, that kind of distinguish them from other Ptolemies. And then in that far right category, every once in a while, we have some other people who are brought in that are really important for what's happening politically. Okay, so you have the daughter of the king there. We've got a few slides to talk through that. So, Ptolemy Philadelphus. So, Ptolemies, remember, are the southern kingdom, Egypt. He set up his daughter Berenice with Antiochus II, who was in charge of Syria, the northern kingdom. So, at this point, as you read, they're allies. And Ptolemy in the south thinks, I'm going to make this alliance stronger by setting up my daughter Berenice with the husband, or with the ruler of Syria, Antiochus II. And he hopes that, by having his own daughter as part of this royal line, then they'll either be, one of two things will happen. Either the Syria won't attack him, or maybe he can have some sway in Syria through his daughter. Problem is, Antiochus II is already married when this happens to a woman named Laodice. So at some point, Antiochus II goes back to that first wife, Laodice, and now you've got this Egyptian woman and her kids in Syria, who now could be usurpers to the throne. So sadly, Berenice and her children with Antiochus II are all murdered. Well, so Laodice is not real happy with Antiochus II for marrying someone else and leaving her out. So even though she does take it back, she then has him killed and puts their son, Seleucus II, on the throne. So the net result of this, of Ptolemy Philadelphus's attempt to make things stronger, so he dies, not related to this, he dies of something else, but his wife and his kids and her husband are all dead. So the daughter of the king plan fails dramatically. What happens in the aftermath? So Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, so Philadelphus' son, invades Syria and then kills Laodice to get revenge on her for killing Berenice. This is all very dramatic, very soap opera here. And then Ptolemy III seizes the Egyptian gods, or that should say Syrian gods, seizes the Syrian gods' metal and images. And Seleucus II, remember that's Laodice's son that she put on the throne, he rebuilds the army after this terrible defeat, invades Egypt, and was defeated. So he tries to fight back, but it doesn't go well. His sons, Seleucus III and Antiochus III, had slightly more success. That's where it talks about they carried the battle as far as his fortress. So they did push the Egyptians back south. They didn't overtake Egypt, but they kind of made it more, okay, now we're our two empires again on what seems to be even footing. Ptolemy IV, Philopator, fought back and forced the Syrian army to retreat now. And things seemed, he could have gone even further, it seems. Like, it seemed like he was a very powerful ruler, and if he had wanted to, he maybe could have overtaken Syria. Instead, he retreated back to palace life and lost the respect of his citizens, for he just was not, military things were not his specialty. So he won this great battle and just decided, I'm going to go back to my palace and live in luxury. And the people of Egypt had no use for that, as you might expect. So now Egypt, instead of pressing forward, stops, and Antiochus III has a chance to raise an even larger army. So we've pushed back towards Syria. Instead of taking over Syria, Egypt retreats. Now Syria is building up their army and going back down. Understand it all? Yeah, great. I know, this is all confusing. All right, let's read the next section here. That would be verse 14. In those times, many will rise against the king of the south, so rise against the ruler of Egypt. Those who are violent among your own people, Daniel, he's about talking about the Jews, will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. Then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land. Remember, that's a phrase that the book of Daniel uses to describe Israel. He will have the power to destroy it. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south, and he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom. But his plans will not succeed or help him. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them. But a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall, to be seen no more forever. His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. So let's again bring up our map here and say, maybe this makes more sense now that we've gone through a few sections, that you can see why Israel and why they're suffering so much because of this, and why God would want Daniel to know this, that Israel is going to have a very tough time for the next couple hundred years, that their land is going to be a battlefield in a very big way. Bring this back up here. So where we are now, we have Antiochus III, who's in control of Syria, and Ptolemy V is in control of Egypt. Remember Ptolemy IV, a Philopator up there? He was the one who could have pushed into Syria and overtaken them, but decided to retire to his life. You have a section that's entitled Rebellion in the Beautiful Land. So what God tells Daniel here is some of the Jews see this opportunity in the Egyptian strife to rebel against Egypt. So things with Israel under Egypt the second time around, so we're not talking about the book of Exodus, this is, things have kind of come full circle here where Egypt is in control of Israel again. Things have been pretty good. But for some reason, some of the Jews in the area are going to rebel against this and see this as an opportunity to maybe take back control of their land a little bit. So they support Antiochus III, who's rebuilding his army and coming back down to Egypt. And Antiochus does help them. He places the Egyptian forces in Jerusalem under siege. So you've got these Egyptian soldiers who are in Jerusalem. They say, hey, Antiochus, if you help us, we'll be loyal to you. So Antiochus III comes down and surrounds the Egyptian soldiers in Jerusalem and defeats them. Now, Antiochus has this plan where he's going to another political marriage. So he has this daughter, and he's going to send her to be married to one of the princes in Egypt. And his thought is, okay, well, she'll be loyal to me no matter what. Now I have sort of an operative in the Egyptian kingdom. Well, it didn't work that way. The daughter was not loyal to Antiochus. She didn't want to be his pawn in the Egyptian government. She just wanted to be a good wife to her Egyptian prince. So that plan kind of fails completely. There's a section called Coastline Plan Failure. So Antiochus III is not content with just taking over Israel or Egypt. I mean, he wants to be ruler of the world. So he starts pushing out into the Mediterranean. We'll bring a map up here for you. So just pushing out of the Mediterranean, and you can see, so on the far right would be where Syria is. Syria is just off the map here, but you've got Israel in the bottom right corner, and then you've got Cairo. You can just see that visibly there. So he has taken over Israel. He's pushed into Egypt, and now he goes out in the Mediterranean. You can see where Greece is and Athens. He doesn't attack Greece mainland, but he does attack some islands off the coast of Greece. And you have Rome way up there in the top left corner. Now, they hear that Antiochus is coming. They see he's made some of these victories. They don't like it. And so they come and really handily defeat Antiochus III in battle. It happened, I think, 190 BC, a Roman commander named Scipio. And so essentially Antiochus III got too big for his britches. He tried to take over more land than he really had the ability to do, and was pushed back. So you have this next section that says Royal Tax Collector. Antiochus III went home defeated and sad to his fortresses. And, history does report that he just was really depressed, went home to his fortresses after this world domination plan fell apart. And as we're told here, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. We don't know entirely what that means, just sort of sad ending to his life. His successor, Seleucus IV, finds this massive debt. It turns out that Antiochus III, trying to take over the world, it's kind of expensive. And so he had accrued this massive debt. So on top of that, now they had to pay tribute to Rome. Rome not only defeated them in this battle, but said, guess what? For your insolence, now you get to pay us money each year because we defeated you. So what does Seleucus IV do? Well, here's where the Jews come in again. He robs the temple treasury in Jerusalem to help pay their taxes, so they don't have to. Syria then doesn't have to necessarily look as bad or as poor. They can still maintain this level of splendor because the temple tax or temple treasury is paying their tribute. Number 3 there, and all these questions, I know we're not talking through them in depth, just there's so much information to cover here. We'll talk about these more in the Zoom meeting. Describe how you might use a section like this to help a teenager understand how we should feel about the pursuit of power as a Christian. I'll just say this for now. It's all this stuff is sandcastles. You think of how easily a sandcastle is washed away by the water. Even if, a child or an adult, adult made this one here, makes it really nice and really, ornate. The water comes in and just so easily pulls it apart. I think power seems so appealing to us here on this earth. Ultimately, power is fleeting. The power of the government. You watch this time-lapse, section of empires rise and fall. Antiochus III thinks he's so great that he's going to take over the world. In one battle, it's all done, and he goes home depressed. So the devil convinces us that power is this really awesome, great thing, but it's so fleeting. All right, let's read our next section, starting at verse 21. He will be succeeded by a contemptible person. So this is Seleucus IV who's being succeeded by a contemptible person who has not yet been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them, and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot to overthrow fortresses, but only for a time. Antiochus Epiphanes, we meet again. We previously met him in chapter 8. He was one of the descendants of these. Greece is parceled out into 4 pieces. He's one of the people that ends up in charge of one of these 4 pieces. So he's a Syrian ruler, just an awful guy. As you read here, he had not been given the honor of royalty. He should not have been in line for the throne. In fact, his brother was. His brother was the ruler, and when his brother died, his brother's son was being held hostage in Rome. Now, rather than being a good, brother and uncle and going to rescue his son, Antiochus Epiphanes said, "Well, my nephew's not here. Guess I'll be in charge." And as you maybe picked up from this short section here, he just was a completely deceitful man. That last bullet point, he used deceit, bribery, and flattery to get what he wanted. So by intrigue, it seemed like a man that was kind of persuasive in this sort of slimy, greasy way, using whatever tools he could to get what he wanted. And he would, plunder these different nations and then use the money to buy people's loyalty to him. Number 4, for a time, is a key phrase in this whole section. Explain how this puts the struggles of the beautiful land in perspective. Again, we'll talk more about that in the Zoom group. But here's a picture of a roller coaster. What's happening for these hundreds of years in Israel seems so chaotic and terrible. But this phrase, for a time, helps us understand it's all under God's control. A roller coaster, I don't know how long it's been since you were on a roller coaster, but there are parts of a roller coaster at Kings Island where it just feels like this is the end. We're going through this loop-to-loop and we're going to fall, or we're going too fast, we're going to crash, and it's all very carefully choreographed. They have people that come and check the safety all the time. So this feels a little bit like a roller coaster to the people of Israel. There's ups and there's downs, but ultimately it's all under the control of God. All right, next section is verse 25. With a large army he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage a war with a large and powerful army, but will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The 2 kings with their hearts bent on evil will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. One of the things we had heard above about Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, is that he will succeed where his forefathers had failed. And that's talking probably about his campaigns against Egypt. That I believe Antiochus Epiphanes attacked Egypt 4 times during his rule and never successfully captured it, but had a lot more success than the rulers before him. So he did defeat Ptolemy Philometor in battle. Again, didn't overtake Egypt completely, but did win a big battle against Egypt in the south. When Egypt saw that this had happened, they were so upset with Ptolemy Philometor that they replaced him with his brother. So Antiochus sees an opportunity here. He's going to try to work an alliance with Philometor. So they sit down at the table, and Antiochus makes him all these promises. Okay, if you and I work together and you help me defeat Egypt, you'll have this role. I'll give you your kingdom back. And, Philometor's sitting there knowing that Antiochus is lying. And he's, goes along with this plan like, hey, yeah, we're brothers in this, and we can be powerful together. But he knows, too, that the instant they overtake Egypt, that Antiochus Epiphanes can try to set him aside. So there's an interesting phrase here. They'll sit at the same table and lie to each other. So there's just this political deceit going on, but they're both deceiving each other. So Antiochus goes with Ptolemy Philometor to try to take over Egypt, and they march in Alexandria, and they're defeated. So again, some success, but still can't quite get over that hump of completely defeating Egypt. So he's angry, and on the way he takes it out. He's got to go back home from Egypt to Syria, cross right through Israel. So he takes it out on Jerusalem on the way. How frustrated he is that he couldn't overtake Egypt. Kills 80,000 men, women, and children while enslaving 40,000 others. He steals valuables from the altar, the gold and silver vessels, and then sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple, which, again, Old Testament laws, they weren't supposed to eat pigs. That was unclean. So not only are you taking a pig into the temple, but to sacrifice it on the altar was just a huge deal. Number 5, God sure has a funny way of showing how much he cares for the people of this beautiful land. How would you respond? So the average reader might look at this and say, man, God is being kind of rough with these people, allowing them to go through all this stuff. But if you remember what Pastor Ruster talked about in chapters 9 and 10, why was Daniel in such mourning at the beginning of Daniel chapter 9? Is because he knew the Israelites had not changed in their 7 years of exile. Some of them had gone back to Jerusalem to start rebuilding the temple, and they had done a little bit and then stopped. So why is God still letting this happen? Well, because Israel never really learned its lesson. They just don't. So one of the helpful things I've found for explaining why God acts and speaks the way that he does to the people in the Old Testament is because they need discipline. They need someone to raise their voice, to let them know what they're doing is seriously wrong. One of the pictures I sometimes use is, if you have a child that's running out into the street, here you have a child that's running out in the street to get a ball. Would you raise your voice to warn the child to get out of the street and avoid danger or even death? Of course you would. And if the child did it again, would you raise your voice even more the second, third, fourth time? Would you take drastic steps to make sure your kid did not run out in the street anymore? You would. That's Old Testament history, is God raising his voice at Israel to lead them out of danger, them ignoring him, and him just kind of stepping it up more and more and saying, okay, if you don't listen, this is what I'm going to do. You didn't listen, so this is what I'm going to do now. All right, next section is verse 29. At the appointed time he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the holy covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the holy covenant. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then he will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword, or be burned, or captured, or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. So, we said at the beginning that things are going to be rough for Israelites. It's going to continue on during Antiochus Epiphanes' rule, and we learned that in chapter 8. So Antiochus Epiphanes attacked Egypt again in 168 BC, just obsessed with taking over the southern empire. But the Roman army is just offshore, and they show up and remind Antiochus Epiphanes that they are really in charge. And if Antiochus Epiphanes insists on attacking Egypt anymore, he's going to have to deal with them instead. So Antiochus Epiphanes realizes he's not powerful enough to take on Rome, so he withdraws and he attacks Jerusalem again because he's mad and because they're right there. This time, he focuses on the Jews who had turned their backs on Judaism. So all the Jews that did not follow the covenant God made with Abraham, who really didn't care anymore about the Messiah, he tries to use them against the Jews who are still loyal to God, because he really wants to eradicate the worship of God. He's not an atheist. He does believe in the Greek gods. As we mentioned in chapter 8, he did put a statue of Zeus or Jupiter, it's kind of the same thing, in the temple, which is the abomination that causes desolation. That he takes out the temple of the true God and takes out the altar of the true God and puts an altar to a fake, false God in the temple, which is just crazy. Well, some Jews did resist, and they paid a steep price. We hear about that here. Some of them are killed. Some of them are imprisoned. But they will receive a little help, God says. And that comes in the form of Judas Maccabeus leading an uprising and taking Jerusalem back. So they did fight back, and they took back Jerusalem, and this became the basis for the Hanukkah celebrations. Back page there. Maybe just a word on number 7. Someone is struggling with some very heavy things in their life. Explain how the refining picture might give you a starting point for talking with them. That is a picture that God touches on here, the refining process. So you heat up gold, and the impurities run out, and allows you to have either 100% pure gold or purer than it was before. By allowing this suffering, God forces the Jews to realize how much they need Him, and they cling to Him, rather than clinging to these false gods or their idea of who they are as a nation and things like that. So this, we'll talk more about that in the Zoom study. But just a powerful picture to describe hard things happen, but it serves a purpose. Our lives are heated up, so to speak, so that all our unbelief and our doubts can run out, and we can be strengthened in God's grace and His promises. Right, this last section here, we're going to touch on this just very quickly. The king who exalts himself. This doesn't seem to be Antiochus Epiphanes anymore, and it's difficult for us because we don't have, a big transition where Daniel or the angel messenger says, I'm talking about someone else now. But everything that he says here in this last section doesn't seem to fit what we know historically about Antiochus Epiphanes or any other political figure. It seems to be talking about more of a spiritual enemy. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or the one desired by women. This is one thing that helps us understand this probably isn't Antiochus Epiphanes, because Antiochus Epiphanes showed a lot of respect for the God of his ancestors. He put a statue to Zeus in the temple. Nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. So someone who thinks of themselves as being above even the God of Israel. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses. A god unknown to his ancestors he will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. So neither of these, Syria or Egypt could be mentioned here, because they're attacking this guy. They're going in battle. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Cushites in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Who is this king? Again, it doesn't seem to be Antiochus Epiphanes, and that second bullet point, much of this last section is difficult to pin down to a certain thing. Okay, Ammon, Edom, Moab, all these things, we just don't know. It's all pretty much conjecture. What we could say is that this does seem to be a spiritual enemy. And a big key to there is right off the bat, that first verse, it will say unheard of things against the God of gods. So you're looking for an enemy that's speaking against what God has said is good and right and true. And number 8 there, we'll talk about that in the Zoom class, but you've got some different types of teachings that really stand against God, and you kind of boil all of them down to spiritual teaching that makes it about us. about our intelligence, our works righteousness, our feelings. You really see how religion has shifted to that point. Even lots of Christianity, we would see fulfillment of some of these things in the Church of Martin Luther's day. You think of how powerful the papacy was on the political stage, that they did wheel and deal, and they did put rulers in their places, and it did cost them a lot of money sometimes to have this political power. So here is a spiritual enemy that does have a lot of political sway. So we would identify that Church of Luther's day is partial fulfillment of this, but it also causes us to think about any type of teaching that stands itself up against God. And we'll talk about that more in the meeting. But ultimately, the time lapse ends with what? That last phrase there, he will come to an end and no one will help him. So you think about the villains in our world history that have done awful things and then been defeated when it seemed like maybe there was no chance of them being brought down. I think of when Saddam Hussein was discovered in that little, what they call a spider hole. Here was this man who had caused the death and just brought misery to so many people. And he's hiding in a little hole, and they find him, and he just looks kind of pathetic. No one's there to help him. They bring him out, and that's it. So here was this awful enemy who is brought low in such a humble way. That's finally what will happen to any spiritual, physical, political, military enemy who sets themselves up against God. It might look like they're in control for a while, but ultimately they will come to an end and no one will help them because victory is inevitable. Same conclusion we drew in chapter 8. At the end of the day, God is still in control. Our victory in Christ is already secure. So no matter how up and down this world can be, we know how the story ends. The time-lapse video has lots of crazy things in it. And if you look at our world history as a time-lapse video, there'd be some incredibly awful things to see. But the time-lapse video ends in a good place with the King of Kings in control and us being taken home to heaven. All right, that's all chapter 11. That was a longer video today, so thanks for sticking with it if you made it to this point, and we'll finish with chapter 12 next week. All right, God's blessings to you. Bye.